So just by way of introduction, briefly, so Kirsten is a third year doctoral student, jointly based at James Hutton Institute and the Countryside and Community Research Institute. Her doctoral research examines the relationship between remote work and mobility in the UK context, with particular interest in mobility patterns, lived experiences, and implications for rural areas. Kirsten's work uses a mixed methods approach, combining quantitative analysis of understanding society data and in-depth interviews and focus groups, which I believe we're going to hear more about now. So just I'll hand the floor over to Kirsten, and Kirsten will speak for about 35, 40 minutes, and we'll have opportunities afterwards for questions. So thank you, everyone. Thanks, Kirsten.
Thanks, David. Yeah, I'll just try again to share my screen. Okay, so hopefully, I'll just move this over. Hopefully everyone can see that. And if there's any kind of problems at any point, just let me know. Okay, so yeah, hello everybody. And as David said, I'm Kirsten. And today I'll be sharing some findings from my PhD research. And just before I get started, I would just like to thank the James Hutton Institute and the University of Gloucestershire for funding this work, and also to acknowledge the contributions of my supervisors, Max Curry, John Hopkins, Bryony Goodwin-Hawkins, and Joni Willett. Okay. So I'll just start off with some brief background then. As I'm sure you all know, COVID led to a significant increase in remote and hybrid working rates across many countries, including the UK. And the latest figures show that 41% of UK workers now work remotely at least some of the time. So just to say that when I refer to remote work in this presentation, I'm using the term to refer to both remote and hybrid work, although I'll also be pulling out some distinctions between the two at some points throughout. And remote work is influencing workers' mobilities in two different ways. So through their residential decision making. So, for example, if you don't have to go into work so often, you might be able to live further away from your workplace, and also through more localized daily forms of movement. So how you commute might change if you can remote work, or the type of workspace you use on a daily basis might be different. And so in the literature at the moment, 6 distinct mobilities have been studied in relation to remote work. So these include residential mobilities, which I've coloured blue on the slide, and pink is daily mobilities. So those 2 different types I referred to in the previous slide. So I'll just talk through the kind of state of the literature of these 6 mobilities to start off with. So first is counter-urbanization. So the media and some academic studies during the pandemic suggested that remote workers were rushing to live in rural areas as they were no longer tied down to city centre workplace locations. However, the long-term nature of this trend remains quite unclear, including whether people have since returned to cities or moved only to more accessible rural locations. The second mobility is residential multi-local work. So this is just a fancy term for periodically working from multiple residential locations. And in the literature, this is often linked to the use of second homes, whether that's in an urban or a rural setting. The third mobility is residential immobility. So simply put, this is the idea that remote work might enable people to stay put in their homes where they might otherwise have had to move house, for example, during a job change. The fourth mobility is commuting. So remote work impacts both commute length and mode. And the literature suggests that remote workers tend to commute less frequently, but they may travel further when they do commute. The fifth mobility that's been linked to remote work in the literature is daily multi-local work. So this is essentially the idea of using multiple workspaces within a day or a week. And in the pre-pandemic literature, this was often linked to non-remote workers like manual labourers or delivery drivers who were more likely to work across multiple different locations than remote workers. But this likely needs updating to now reflect hybrid work and the increased use of co-working spaces, cafes, and so on. And the final mobility is daily immobility. So this involves staying at home or being largely immobile during the workday, for example, sitting at a desk all day without a commute. And this mobility type is often linked to health and well-being impacts. So just to note that previous studies have generally examined these residential and daily mobilities separately, but throughout the work I'll be presenting today, I'm going to be combining their analysis in an innovative way to explore the relationships between them. So I've identified three main research gaps in the study of remote work and mobilities in the contemporary literature. So first, despite widespread claims that remote work impacts mobility, very few studies have directly compared the mobilities of remote and non-remote workers in the post-pandemic period. And as a result, we know very little actually about how much remote workers' mobilities have actually changed compared to non-remote workers. Second, there's limited evidence on how remote workers themselves experience and make sense of their mobilities post-pandemic. We don't fully understand how they perceive new patterns, such as reduced commutes, moves to rural areas, or increased daily immobility. And third, although there is growing interest in the spatial and place-based effects of remote work-related mobility trends like counter-urbanization, most of this research has focused so far on urban areas, and where rural impacts have been suggested, they remain largely theoretical and have not really been tested empirically. So to address these three gaps, I have conducted what is essentially three separate sub-studies, and today I'll be sharing some of the key empirical findings from these sub-studies. So first, I'll present my findings from the analysis addressing the first research question. So how do remote workers' mobilities differ from those of non-remote workers post-pandemic? And to do this, I've used data from the UK Household Longitudinal Study, also known to many as Understanding Society. This is a longitudinal panel study conducted by the Institute for Social and Economic Research. And specifically, I've used data from waves 10 and 14, covering pre-pandemic and post-pandemic periods. What I've done is conducted bivariate statistical tests and regression models to explore the relationship between remote work and the mobility outcomes across the mobilities I outlined earlier. A key limitation is that unfortunately I was not able to examine daily immobility in this analysis, which the UK HLS doesn't have data on. All of the models were estimated using the survey package in RStudio. And just a quick note for those familiar with the Understanding Society data on remote work and working from home, some of the frequency categories I'm going to be referring to, including mainly, sometimes, and never, may seem unusual. This is because I recoded the variable to account for respondents who selected home as their main work location, but didn't respond to the frequency question in the survey. And I'm happy to discuss this further at the end if anyone's interested. Okay, so first I'll present some results exploring the relationship between counter-urbanization and remote work. So this plot shows the percentage of people who mainly, sometimes, and never work remotely, and how many of them made an urban to rural move between waves 10 and 14 of the UK HLS. So the data shows that those who sometimes worked remotely were the most likely to make such a move, followed by those who mainly worked remotely, and then those who never did. And a chi-squared test was conducted to examine this relationship, and it indicated that the association between remote work frequency and moving from an urban to rural area was statistically significant. And then these are the results from a logistic regression model exploring the same relationship. Don't worry about all the kind of numbers here. What's really important and what I was interested in is whether remote work remained a significant predictor of counter-urbanization after controlling for other factors. So the model accounts for the influence of variables like age, having dependent children, and income, all of which have previously been shown to influence somebody's likelihood of moving to a rural area. And the results show that remote work was a positive but non-significant predictor of counter-urbanization. So what this means is that although remote workers might be more likely to move to rural areas than non-remote workers, other factors, especially life course related factors like being married and having a higher income, actually play a stronger role in driving these moves. I also want to briefly discuss a key aspect of the counter-urbanization and remote work literature, which is the donut effect. So this refers to the idea that city centres are hollowing out as people move out, but the remote workers are more likely to relocate to accessible rural areas rather than more remote ones. And to explore this Sankey diagram shows the types of urban areas that remote workers have moved out of on the left-hand side, and then the types of rural areas that they have moved to on the right-hand side. And the blue section at the top, just to note, is the Scottish urban rural classification, and the rest of the bars are the England and Wales classification. And really what stands out here is that the most popular rural destinations are accessible rural areas like towns, fringes, and villages that are not classified as sparse or remote. And in fact, a simple additional comparison reveals that 95% of counter-urban moves have been to accessible rather than remote rural areas. And this confirms findings from other studies showing that remote workers primarily move to places where urban centres remain within easy reach, supporting the presence of the donut effect in the UK. I'll now move on to talk about residential multi-local work. So again, just to recap, this is the idea of working periodically from multiple residential locations. And this was measured using a variable on second home ownership. It is really important to note here that owning a second home is obviously not a direct proxy from working from that home, but it does give us an indication of how remote work is associated with spending residential time in multiple locations. So as shown here, second home ownership increases with remote work frequency. Those who mainly work remotely are the most likely to own a second home, and this relationship was statistically significant. However, again, when we control for other factors like age and income, which are significant predictors in this model of second home ownership, remote work itself was not a significant predictor. And this suggests that perhaps despite claims in the literature, remote work would drive a rise in second home ownership and use, and this increase may not be happening to the extent some studies have suggested. Okay, moving on to think about residential immobility. So we see here that those who never work remotely are statistically the most likely to remain residentially immobile. So this is contrary to some suggestions in the literature that remote work could promote residential immobility by enabling people to stay living in the same place even when they were changing jobs. And actually the data instead shows that remote workers are actually more likely still to move house than non-remote workers. And this relationship is supported by the regression model this time, where remote work remains a significant predictor when we control for other variables. So we can now move on to consider some of the daily mobilities that the literature suggests are impacted by remote work. So research indicates that remote workers tend to have longer commute times than non-remote workers, and this relationship is supported by these findings, which show that remote workers have longer average commute times. And this is further supported by the regression model, where remote work emerged as a positive and significant predictor this time of longer commute times. Just to note, a couple of other interesting predictors also appeared, including gender, which aligns with existing literature showing that women generally have shorter commute times than men. Here we can see that those who sometimes work remotely are the most likely to work across multiple locations, and this likely reflects the unique dynamics of hybrid working, with people moving between the home and office periodically. And interestingly, those who mainly work remotely also engage in this practice, so this might involve things like working from cafes, co-working spaces, or other locations. Okay, so this is the last slide here. So these findings are again supported by the regression model, and this contradicts the traditional association in the literature where working in multiple locations has mainly been linked, as I mentioned, to non-remote jobs like delivery drivers or construction workers, and other interesting significant predictors also emerged, such as gender and marital status. Okay, so bringing together the sort of findings from this first sub-study, what can we kind of say? So we've seen that remote workers are generally more mobile than non-remote workers. So we've seen they're more likely to move to a rural area, commute longer distances, own a second home, work across multiple locations, and be less residentially immobile. However, we've also seen that traditional factors like income and family status often remain the strongest predictors of mobility outcomes, especially for residential mobilities. It's also important to note that remote work is mainly tied to professional, often well-paid occupations, and along with being more mobile, these workers tend to have greater control over their movements. Whereas in contrast, non-remote workers are likely to remain more tied to place. For example, they still need to commute to work 5 days a week, and this dynamic has the potential to deepen existing workforce inequalities between remote and non-remote workers, or we could also say perhaps between professional and manual workers in the post-pandemic period. Okay, so now I'll move on to present some of the findings from the second sub-study, which explored how remote workers experience their mobilities in the post-pandemic period. So this sub-study is based on interviews with 41 remote workers living across the UK. And participants were asked a variety of questions about their mobilities, and they were also invited to send a photo that represented how remote work impacted their daily and residential location choices. And discussions about these photos formed an important part of the data. And yeah, just to note that all the data was analysed thematically using NVivo. So first, I'll talk through some of the findings on remote workers' experiences of counter-urbanisation. So remote work played a diverse role in participants' decisions to move to rural areas. For some, remote work was a direct and crucial factor in their decision. They said without it, they wouldn't have considered relocating to the countryside. Whereas for others, remote work was more of a subtle background influence. Often, life course factors such as having children or reaching a certain age were the primary drivers of counter-urban moves, with remote work acting more as an enabler. This aligns with the regression results that I presented in the previous section, where several life course variables emerged as significant predictors of counter-urbanisation. The photo on the right there was sent by one participant who explained that although remote work had allowed them and their partner to move to a rural area, their decision was really mainly motivated by a desire to raise their daughter in a green environment, as is illustrated in the quote at the bottom. And I'm not going to read out all of the quotes throughout these slides. Feel free to just have a read as I'm talking, or alternatively, I'm more than happy to share the slides at the end if anyone would like to read through them in more detail. So despite widespread discussion of the donut effect I mentioned earlier, no studies have yet explored why this effect is occurring or really why remote workers feel the need to stay accessible to cities. The qualitative evidence from the interviews revealed two main reasons that people want to stay connected to urban areas. First, many want the best of both worlds. So they want to retain aspects of an urban lifestyle, such as access to cultural events and clubs. And the quote there illustrates how participants valued the contrast between urban and rural living as well. And second, the dominance of hybrid work arrangements post-pandemic means that people still need to travel into the office occasionally. And as the quote at the bottom shows, many did not want to move so far away that commuting became totally impractical. I'll now talk about some findings about remote workers' experiences of residential multi-local working. So for a few participants, remote work was enabling them to spend more time in their second homes. Some were even considering permanent moves to second homes or had already made such a move. This illustrates how the boundary between residential moves and residential multi-local living can perhaps be blurred or seen as different stages of commitment to areas as well. And the photo here was sent by a participant who had moved permanently to her second home on a Scottish island after her workplace adopted fully remote arrangements. However, it's really important to note here that these experiences were relevant to only a very small number of participants, and the most commonly discussed forms of residential multi-local working, where people worked across multiple residential locations, were really outside the formal property-based structures that the literature often associates with this practice. So for some participants, remote work enabled them to visit family or take on caregiving responsibilities for elderly relatives while continuing to work remotely. And this flexibility was highly valued and seen as a significant advantage of remote working. Others, particularly foreign nationals, valued remote work because it allowed them to travel internationally, to visit family and friends for longer periods than would have been possible if they had only been using their annual leave. And again, just to reiterate, these examples illustrate much more informal, flexible and temporary forms of multi-local living in it that were enabled by remote work, but which fall outside the traditional definitions of the practice often in the literature. I'll now move on to residential immobility. So while the quantitative analysis I presented earlier suggested that remote workers are, on average, still more residentially mobile than non-remote workers, the qualitative analysis also revealed that remote work can enable residential immobility for some workers, and this was actually really highly valued. So, for example, remote work allowed some participants to better balance family and career demands when considering where to live. So for those committed to staying living within a particular region because of partners or family ties, remote work opened up access to a much broader labour market. And several participants who had previously followed highly mobile career paths described being able to settle in one place for the first time and build longer term social connections. In addition, for participants with strong senses of place attachment, remote work made it possible to prioritise staying where they wanted to live over career-driven mobility. In the past, these individuals may have felt that they had to move away to progress in their careers, but this might no longer be necessary. And just to note that these benefits were particularly significant for participants living in rural areas where local job opportunities may be more limited, and the ability to work remotely can make remaining in place a longer term viable option. Okay, and now thinking a bit about commuting and people's experiences of commuting related to remote work. So it will perhaps not surprise you to hear that many participants described reduced commuting as the main benefit of remote work, particularly those living in large cities who had previously experienced very long or highly stressful commutes. For those working in hybrid arrangements, commuting less frequently shaped how people felt about their commute when it did occur. So for some, reduced frequency made commuting more manageable by limiting cumulative fatigue, whereas for others, actually experiencing life without a daily commute made the remaining journeys feel more frustrating or annoying. Despite this, participants were generally willing to tolerate longer commutes when these were only required a few days a week. And in some cases, remote work enabled participants who were almost fully remote to engage in so-called mega commutes. These were often not experienced negatively, largely because they occurred infrequently. And for some participants, traveling to work was even described as a novelty or a welcome change of scene because they were so used to just staying inside. So perhaps in a somewhat contradictory way, some other participants noted that one of the main disadvantages of remote work was the loss of the commute as a clear transition between home and work. And there were also notable differences in how commuting was perceived depending on whether journeys were urban or rural. So urban commutes were frequently described in terms of stress, congestion, and urgency, whereas rural commutes were often experienced more positively, with participants talking about enjoying driving through the countryside, for example. However, these positive rural commuting experiences were largely limited to those with access to a car. So several participants highlighted challenges associated with rural public transport. But in some cases, remote work had actually helped to offset these difficulties. So, for example, there was one participant who described having to take 3 buses to get to work, where she went in 1 day a week, noting that this job would just not have been feasible for her if she had been required to commute there more frequently. I also explored participants' experiences of engaging in daily multi-local working. So some participants described using different spaces for different tasks, for example, as cafes for lighter or more administrative work, and libraries for more focused work with fewer distractions. However, for most participants, working outside of their usual home or office was not a routine practice, but was really just a practical solution to specific problems. So these spaces were typically used to deal with issues such as internet outages or when participants arrived early somewhere for a meeting and needed a space to sit for a few hours and work. The 2 most frequently discussed other workspaces were cafes and co-working spaces. So some younger participants in particular talked positively about working in cafes, often saying it reminded them of their student days. However, many also highlighted drawbacks, including noise, cost, unreliable internet, and feelings of guilt about staying too long. Very few participants reported using co-working spaces. The most common reason for this given was cost, with many feeling they were just too expensive to justify. Those who did use co-working spaces were typically self-employed or freelancers, which broadly reflects patterns of co-working use before the pandemic. While this is obviously not statistically representative, it does challenge some claims in the pandemic era literature that large numbers of employed workers would begin using co-working spaces with the rise of remote and hybrid work. Finally, there were clear spatial differences in experiences of daily multi-local working. So urban remote workers were far more likely than rural workers to talk about using cafes or co-working spaces, reflecting differences in the availability, cost, and local infrastructure of these spaces. Turning to participants' experiences of daily immobility, many, as you might expect, spent much of the day seated at a desk and described how remote work had increased their day-to-day immobility. For some, this was experienced positively, contributing to a calmer routine and, in some cases, a more peaceful way of life. However, for others, daily immobility was experienced as confining or isolating and was linked to concerns about health and well-being. Many viewed their increasingly sedentary routines as detrimental to their physical health, and while some participants actively engaged in what could be considered compensatory mobilities, such as taking a daily walk or moving around the home just to stretch, others found this difficult and instead described missing the enforced movement that came with office-based work. So then again, trying to kind of pull these findings from the second sub-study together, there's quite a lot I could say here, but again, I'll just focus on a few key points. First of all, the findings reinforce a point I made earlier. Alongside being often more mobile than non-remote workers, remote workers also tend to have greater control over their mobilities. So they have more freedom to engage in the flexible practices I've discussed throughout this section. In the literature, the greater capacity and opportunity to be mobile is often described as motility, and it's widely recognised as a privileged condition. And in that sense, remote work here risks privileging an already privileged group of workers. Linked to this, there were also clear inequalities among remote workers in how remote work was experienced. I haven't had time to explore this in detail, but social and spatial mediators, such as urban or rural residents, class background, housing tenure, and access to a car, all shaped how mobilities were experienced. And these factors are not well developed in the existing literature, but they are clearly important. Another key point is that throughout the interviews, participants described several mobilities influenced by remote work that have not previously been linked to remote working in the literature. So one example of this is the daily walk. So while taking a walk at lunchtime or before or after work might not seem as significant a mobility as something like residential relocation or mega commuting, it was repeatedly described by participants as one of the most valued and meaningful mobilities associated with remote work. And then finally, as I noted at the start, residential and daily mobilities are often studied separately. However, the data here shows that they are closely connected for remote workers, and actually decisions or experiences about one form of mobility, like a counter-urban relocation, can often then shape a commuting experience or how daily immobility is experienced, for example. Okay, I'm now going to move on to findings from the third sub-study, which shifts focus slightly to examine how the remote work related trends, so the patterns and experiences I've discussed so far, are impacting rural areas. So to explore this, I conducted fieldwork in 3 accessible rural case studies in Scotland. So these are the types of rural areas the donut effect suggests might be the most affected by trends like counter-urbanisation. So I'll just really briefly outline the case study sites. So 2 of the case studies A and B, had high rates of remote work. Case study A was an affluent small town, and case study B was a relatively affluent village. Case study C had a low rate of remote work and was a more deprived village, reflecting the close association between rates of affluence and rates of remote work that has been well documented in the literature. Exploring this diversity of locations allowed me to explore the different types of impacts across different types of communities and see whether communities with lots of remote workers were experiencing more or fewer benefits. The methods that I used involved scoping interviews with key community stakeholders and focus groups with community members. And again, all the data was analysed thematically using NVivo, and there were several themes that kind of emerged from this work. But for the sake of time and to spare you all, today I'll just focus on 3 of the main ones. So the first theme I want to explore is property prices and demand and how remote work was impacting those in rural areas. So the literature has suggested that remote work related trends such as counter-urbanisation, increased second home ownership and residential immobility might be driving up house prices in rural areas. And in case studies A and B, which, just to recap, had high rates of remote work, participants perceived rising property prices during the pandemic. They described how local people were being priced out as city dwellers had moved in, leading to spikes in prices. The role of remote work in this was quite contested, so some participants saw remote work as a key driver, enabling people to live more rurally post-pandemic, while others felt it was simply the latest phase in a longer-term trend of people moving out to these areas. So in contrast, in case study C, with low rates of remote work, there was a bit of a different picture. So residents reported that house prices had remained low throughout the pandemic, and they didn't feel that the area had experienced many people moving in. Instead, they believed that remote workers moving out of nearby cities were more likely to settle in nearby, more quote unquote desirable villages that were better known. Interestingly, this wasn't necessarily seen as a negative thing for the area, and participants actually valued the low house prices and the authentic feel of the village, which they felt had retained many of the same residents over time. So, at a first glance, this might seem quite straightforward. Desirable areas with high rates of remote work experienced house price rises, while case study C with a low rate of remote work did not. However, the actual house price data complicates this picture quite substantially. So in case study A, which you can see is the house prices for case study A are showing the blue bar on the screen. Although prices have long been substantially higher than the Scottish average and still are, the percentage increase between 2019 and 2025 was actually lower at 27.4% compared to the national figure of 30% average. In case study B, the perceived surge in prices during the pandemic aligns more closely with the data. You can see that in orange there, showing a 53.2% increase between 2019 and 2025. And then somewhat surprisingly, case study C, where the perception was that house prices had remained static, actually reported the largest percentage increase since the pandemic at 78.9%, exceeding both the Scottish average and the other case studies. So there are several kind of possible explanations for this discrepancy between perceptions and the empirical data. It could be that there was greater population movement in case study C than residents realised, or that price rises there were driven by completely other factors like housing developments compounded by increases from a relatively low baseline. Other factors may also explain these differences. So residents' perceptions of increased counter-urbanisation during the pandemic, in case study A and B, may have been shaped by media discourses, which arguably exaggerated migration flows in some areas. So this discourse often focused on large-scale movements to amenity-rich coastal areas, like case studies A and B, possibly contributing to exaggerated perceptions of counter-urbanisation and subsequent price rises there. Either way, it's just impossible to know for sure what's driving these trends, and this highlights the challenge of relying solely on perceptions from qualitative data or on quantitative data on house price rises to fully explain such complex phenomena. And hopefully you can see why I've only got time to kind of cover 3 of these themes, because unpicking the actual impact of remote work is just so complicated. Okay, so another key area of discussion in the case studies was how remote work-related mobility trends have impacted community life. So supporting theoretical ideas in the literature that reductions in commuting linked to remote work can provide more time for community involvement and community engagement. Some participants did report increased participation in local groups and organisations. So this was especially evident in case study A, where a wide range of community groups already existed for people to join. Whereas in the smaller villages, so case studies B and C, there were just fewer activities for people to get involved in, and stakeholders also described the real challenges that voluntary organisations were having in recruiting volunteers post-pandemic. However, this also wasn't the experience for everyone, and some participants did describe feeling they were just filling their time with unproductive activities, despite perhaps having the best intentions. Another way that remote work-related mobility trends were impacting community life was through people's feelings of connection to their communities. So some remote workers reported feeling more connected. For example, their increased daily immobility gave them more time to go for walks locally or interact with neighbours. However, others struggled to connect, especially those who had perhaps counter-urbanised around the time of the pandemic or since, and they described how working remotely could actually reduce their social interaction, leaving them stuck in their homes. Many also spoke about losing casual social contacts they used to have while commuting regularly, for instance, through just recognising familiar faces at the train station every day. Isolation also emerged as a frequently discussed theme. So as reflected in this quote at the bottom, many remote workers might find it hard to admit feeling isolated or lonely, as these feelings are not commonly associated with working age adults. And the final theme that I want to briefly cover is the impact of remote work-related mobility trends on local amenities. So literature on the spatial impacts of remote work in urban areas suggests that trends like increased daily immobility and daily multi-local working might lead remote workers to use more local shops and services. Some participants confirmed that this was the case for them, describing increased use of places like butchers, post offices, and cafes. Interestingly, this increased use was also not always limited to people's immediate local area. So some talked about using amenities in other nearby villages or cities, and these weren't necessarily the cities that they worked in as well. So this perhaps suggests there's some sort of hybridization of shopping patterns going on alongside the hybridization of work. These patterns of increased local spending were definitely the most pronounced in case study A, which has a wide range of destination shops and is an affluent area where people also expressed fewer concerns about the cost of living crisis. And in contrast, in case study C, which was again the more deprived area, participants said their shopping habits hadn't changed so much, and there just simply weren't many shops or services available, and those that were there were often too expensive for regular use. So again, trying to pull these findings together for this third sub-study, there are several broader points I could make, but I'll focus on just a couple. First, remote work has the potential to widen inequalities between different types of rural area. So the findings show that case study A, the already affluent and relatively successful quote unquote rural area, was best positioned to benefit from remote work related mobility changes. So its existing range of shops, services and vibrant community groups allowed it to gain more from remote workers spending time and money locally, whereas in contrast, case study C lacked these opportunities. Second, as we've seen throughout this presentation, these trends may also deepen inequalities within communities. So remote work tends to advantage professional workers by offering them greater mobility and motility, potentially exacerbating disparities between professional and non-professional workers in rural areas. And then finally, digital connectivity plays a crucial role. It's really important to note that all of the community studied had decent connectivity, which is a necessary precondition for remote working. This raises the possibility that remote workers who are more likely to maybe move to well-connected areas may reinforce agglomeration effects in such rural areas, while remote and less connected areas could continue to experience depopulation trends. So that's the 3 sub-studies, but a couple of very brief concluding thoughts to try and pull everything together. First, the future of everything I've presented today really depends on the extent to which workers continue to return to office-based working. And if current trends continue, and if younger workers are expected to spend more time in the office to quote unquote prove themselves, as seems to be what's happening at the moment, this could create additional social inequalities within the labour force and within communities. And then finally, I want to note that this presentation has focused on the empirical findings from my PhD, and I've deliberately left out the conceptual contribution where I'm developing a framework to help to explain many of the themes I've discussed today. So this includes connections across scales, socio-spatial mediators of mobilities, and some of the new mobilities that I captured that haven't been covered in the literature before. And if anyone is interested in hearing more about this framework or of any other aspect of the presentation, please do get in touch. I have my email address on the screen there. And in the meantime, thank you very much for listening, and I'm more than happy to answer any questions.
Yeah, thank you very much, Kirsten. That was fascinating, an impressive quantity and quality of work there, and you kept the time as well, so really well done. Would anyone like to kick off with questions? We've got about 10 minutes. Wonder, Kirsten, can I just jump in maybe first, if that's okay? In terms of the implications, you were hinting there at the conceptual framework and things. Do you have any thoughts at this stage on policy implications? So, if you could make a handful of recommendations to businesses or local or national policymakers, do you have any thoughts on what those might be at this stage?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's a crucial part of the research is I have been trying to kind of consider those policy implications as well. And definitely, I mean, I talked there about the three kind of different focuses of the research, and I'd say there's different sort of policy things that come out of each of them. What's bringing to mind is for the third sub-study on the rural impacts. I think particularly, I mean, this isn't going to come as a surprise, but continuing to support connectivity in more remote rural areas, probably because otherwise these agglomeration effects risk happening, and everyone's just going to concentrate in these accessible rural areas, and none of the potential benefits of remote work are going to reach those more remote areas, which perhaps actually could see more benefits. So like if one person counter urbanizes to a remote rural area, that's potentially got a lot more potential benefit than someone moving to a small town. So yeah, that would be one. And then also this kind of risk of social inequalities within areas. I think perhaps supporting affordable housing in rural areas, particularly where areas are seeing these price rises, whether that's due to remote work or not, or remote work's just some kind of contributory factor. I think that would be really important.
Brilliant. Thank you, Kirsten. I see Victoria's got her hand up.
Hi, thanks for that, Kirsten. I wonder if you could share some of the stories of the remote workers from your qualitative, the second study.
Yeah, is anything particularly like that you want to hear about, or just like more kind of general experiences?
It would nice to know some of the stories of why people moved and how they found those moves. So so I should say I research work life, and I'm pivoting from the urban to the rural, and I'm benefiting from those people, I think, while moving from the rural back to the urban, i.e. I've noticed that house prices are lowered, so in some areas. So um, I'm interested in this movement back and forth, the transition back and forth. So you've got some stories around that.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So, I mean, if we're specifically thinking about people who had moved from urban to rural areas, there was definitely a variety of experiences. So, some people, as I mentioned, had really positive experiences and talked about how, they'd moved out to the countryside and this was great because they were able to raise their children in this green environment, go for daily walks in the countryside, and their life was just so much better. I would actually say that was most people's experiences, which kind of contrasts with some ideas in the literature around counter-urbanization, where people might not always realize this idea of the rural idyll. It did seem like most people had. However, there were a couple of people, maybe, I'm thinking of one in particular, who was a younger person who had moved out to a rural area, and they just found that the vibe of the place didn't fit with their stage of life. So they'd moved out with their partner, and they had moved from a city centre, and it just hadn't worked out for them. So in the end, they actually decided to move back to the city centre. So I think a real variety, perhaps contingent on these kind of life course factors around stage of life, and also just personality. Like if you're somebody who values the buzz of the city centre, and then you made a decision to move out in COVID, you might end up regretting that.
Did anyone, can I ask another question? Did anyone in that movement from urban life to rural life, did that transition make anyone kind of reappraise their relationship with work?
It's hard to kind of say off the bat whether it was specifically the move from the urban to rural area which made people reevaluate their relationship with work, but certainly people did seem to be reevaluating their relationship with work more generally around remote work. I think this kind of theme around work-life balance for a lot of people, it just like life became a lot more important, particularly if you didn't have that long commute anymore all the time, and people talked about spending more time with their children and just being more involved in their children's upbringing, things like that. So I definitely think there was a kind of theme around people reevaluating that, but hard to say immediately whether that was because of the urban to rural move or connected to that. But if that's something you're interested in, I can definitely take another look at the data and get back to you as well.
Thanks for that, Kirsten.
Okay, does anyone else have any questions for Kirsten? Ellen.
Yeah, I was wondering, I don't know if it's part of your study at all, but in Wales there are these regulations on the councils can give people higher costs for second homes, and I was wondering if anything like that is happening in England or Scotland, and if that affects how people choose to buy second homes and maybe move to them and things like that.
No, but I did actually take a look at the Welsh regulations when I was doing this, and I thought that was really interesting. And around the kind of second home council tax, there is something that's just happened in Scotland in the last couple of years now, where I'm not sure what the exact rules are, but like you need a license for to have your second home let out, and also I think you maybe have to pay. Yes, this is right. You have to pay double council tax on a second property now, I think. So yeah, that's what I know is going on in Scotland. I don't know about England. Yeah, I'd have to look that up and see.
Thanks, Ellen. I think Tony's got a question as well.
Me?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, thank you. 10 years ago or so, David Brown from Cornell and I did some work on the annual survey of hours and earnings, which gave information longitudinally over time each year for a 1% sample of the workforce that gave both the residence location and the workplace location. And we found that people who moved out into the countryside from a large city particularly were continuing with they increased their length of commute because they had been living closer beforehand. But then later on, they did settle down and they found a more local job, and maybe they're getting sort of more towards retiring age and so on. But I just wondered if the opposite was happening to you, that people moved out into the countryside because they could work remotely, and then they that it was lovely living there, but the work environment and work opportunities weren't as strong as they hoped, and so that they started commuting longer distances again. Did you find
that's
any
really
evidence of that?
interesting. Yeah, that's not something that I actually looked at, is like what's happened to people's work locations. And I don't think that the UK, David will maybe know if it does, but the UK HLS doesn't have any data on work location specifically, I don't think. So that isn't something that you could look at with this data set, but that would be really interesting. And also, I think in terms of future research, like tracking how that changes and people's longer term experiences who've made these counter urban moves, whether they yeah, how many of them move back, how many of them stay there and get a different job. There's been some research I've seen in some studies which also suggest that it's more likely to be people who are moving towards retirement age who have made these moves as well. So perhaps just preempting that retirement by moving out, working your last few years remotely. And then, yeah, so maybe not even looking for another job, but certainly that would be really interesting to look at as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Renee. Thanks, Kirsten. Yeah, I think the understanding society doesn't have both, unfortunately. In theory, the labour force survey would have place of work and place of residence, but when we looked at it, it codes people who do hybrid working, it codes their workplace as their home, which is very frustrating. So that would be nice if that changed.
The problem with the LFS is that although they say they've got a longitudinal sample and they do follow people for 4 quarters or 8 quarters, I can't remember, it's an address-based survey. So if someone moves away from their house, they lose them. So it's only longitudinal for those that stay in the same address.
Yeah,
I was
another
very
frustration with it,
excited.
yeah.
I was very excited recently to participate in the labour force survey, and when they asked me about my working from home arrangement, I was so excited.
Does anyone have any final questions or comments for Kirsten before we wrap up?
No, thanks very much. It's a very impressive piece of work you've been doing.
Maybe, Kirsten, do you want to, before you sign off, do you want to look into your crystal ball and kind of tell us what you think the new normal looks like? If we're having this conversation in 5 years, will everyone be back at work or will it be much the same?
I don't know, because again, David, I'm sure you know this as well, but although there's this kind of discourse at the moment around everyone's going back to the office, actually the statistics show that rates of remote and hybrid work have been relatively stable in the UK since 2023, and it's actually, although there's these kind of big articles in the news that Apple demands everyone back to the office, it's not actually happening everywhere. And I do think that it is here to stay to some extent, not obviously to the extent it was during the pandemic, or maybe it's also going to continue to change in terms of like how many people are hybrid compared to remote. But yeah, I think it's definitely here to stay.
Wonderful. Well, on that note, we might just wrap up there if that's okay. So thanks again to Kirsten for that really fantastic presentation, great research. So the details of the next Inspiring Population seminar will be circulated soon. So that would be probably in 2 months' time. So we'll circulate those details soon, and please do try and come along if you can. Thanks everyone, and thanks to Kirsten. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks a lot.